So of course, this is our fifth of sixth, but fourth webinar that we're going to be offering because we moved the third webinar after the last one. So it's confusing, but we're doing it. We have our wonderful guest, Amy, who is phenomenal, good friend. And so, yeah, she's going to talk more about the topic. Please, as we go forward, put questions in the chat as you have them. We'll scroll back through when we get to kind of the Q&A session piece. If Amy sees a question that she likes while we're talking, even during her kind of first half, Amy, feel free to answer questions if you want during. But yeah, we're going to do the usual 30 minutes and 30 minutes presentation chat. Looking forward to it. Amy, go ahead. You muted still.
Can you hear me okay? Oh, Dylan left.
Yep, you're good.
Okay, thank you. Hey, my name is Amy Gooch. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. Dylan asked me to do this webinar. I'm happy to. I was not sure how equipped I am to talk about conflict, but as we started kind of processing what my experience has been, being a part of a collegiate recovery community and trying to grow one, there were actually a ton of examples of how conflict has shown up. I also want to do a quick land acknowledgement. I'm in Fort Collins, Colorado, which is land belonging to the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations. All right, there we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I came up with the title of the presentation, a little bit of information on how to kind of reframe conflict so that it doesn't feel like scary and awful. I'm going to talk about examples that have come up for me when I was working with RAM recovery, and then ideas and considerations, and then questions with Kat. Let's see. All right, cool. So Mia Birdsong is the author of this book that is in huge text on the screen, but it's one of the very few books I read in 2020. Mia Birdsong is a Black woman who does scholarship specifically around like community and family. And the whole book is kind of like deconstructing our concept of the American dream, which she kind of frames as like having a house in the suburbs, owning property, and kind of how like some of these, like the checklist of the American dream kind of leads to like isolation versus community. And a lot of her friends in her community are like queer identifying or gender non-binary. And so she also talks a lot about how like stepping outside of all of the sort of dominant identities also leads to like this new way that we can think about community, which spoke to me as well. All right. So I should mention my sort of experience with collegiate recovery started in the summer of 2017. So I got sober in January of 2017 as a residence director at Colorado State University. And my friend Ashley, who's the person in the green hat right here, she was a grad student who came from UConn and was kind of a product of their collegiate recovery community. And I got connected with her through Facebook and was like, hey, sorry, the door behind me is moving because of the wind. And I was like, oh my God, it's a ghost. I got connected with her and I was like, hey, I really would love to help you sort of solidify this into something that is part of the institution of CSU versus just like a registered student. I shouldn't say just a registered student org, but I wanted like the administration to support this, to acknowledge that there are students in recovery and seeking recovery on campus. And I thought I could kind of use my connections as a student affairs professional on campus to sort of start having those conversations and get buy-in from different folks. So these are just cute pictures of, this was at Ski-a-thon a couple years ago. And then I think, who's in this picture over here? Hannah and Dylan and Rob and Isabel and Sam and me. And then this was when RAM Recovery went on a trip. But I think finding collegiate recovery was enormous in my sobriety, because I didn't know a lot of other sober people. The friend group that I had at CSU before I got sober was very centered around using substances. And so I kind of like isolated myself for a while and then found all of these folks. And it is like, I can't properly articulate how valuable it is to have a shared experience with other people in recovery. And this was kind of my first profound experience with making a community and being a part of one. I keep trying to use the arrows and that does not work. There's a few examples of like these profound experiences that I've had with community. So that's kind of what I'm going through right now. But when I met my partner, their sort of friend group is called the Queermunity, which is kind of like their chosen family, I would say. And so again, kind of related to queerness and gender identity and things like that. It's not uncommon for those folks to be like not accepted by their families or feel othered by their families, even if they are still connected. And so this concept of queermunity and chosen family also means a lot to me related to community. I'm going to say that a lot of times. All right. The other experience with community that has been like very profound for me is roller derby. So I started skating like the February after I got sober. And little did I know that all of these like wonderful people would become my friends. And so I had not been into sports in high school or anything, so I never had the experience of like being part of a team. But it has been such a rich experience in terms of how we show up for each other, how we like encourage each other's growth. And it's like a very special league and sport. And it also gave me a lot of confidence when I was kind of starting from none. So these are cute pictures of us. This is Thor flipping us the bird. I always feel really cool when I'm skating, but I'm actually smiling like this. And then this is a cute picture of Legs and I. All right. So just to briefly, again, kind of like reframe how we might perceive conflict or like how it feels, even just like hearing the word conflict. I think some folks' response is like to immediately sort of clam up and feel like I avoid that. I'm not interested in engaging in that. But I think it's important to be able to look at it through the lens of like, this is growth. And so I just wrote, conflict is not a negative thing. It usually leads to difficult conversations. There are a lot of ways to do things and make things while you're building your collegiate recovery community or program. And something I emphasized a lot while I was organizing in RAM Recovery is like, I wanted the community to be shaped by all of us and not exclusively by like Ashley or I, or by any like staff members we were getting input from. It's like, this is for all of us. And it should also be created based on the needs that are present right now. So part of co-creation is conflict and dialogue and sharing lived experience. And for a long time, I didn't understand this. Seeking to understand is something that I think is talked a lot about related to conflict and like conversations about equity and diversity. But I think seeking to understand is like asking questions to, again, like understand where someone is coming from versus asking questions to try to like come up with counter arguments or things like that. Hopefully that makes sense. Did it again. All right, cool. Hey, Kat or Dylan, are there any questions in the chat? Because I cannot see it.
Not yet.
Okay, great. How am I doing time-wise?
Phenomenal.
Okay, cool, thank you. So these are some examples of conflict that occurred when I was like the organizer for RAM recovery. And so I kind of broke down all of these scenarios with like, what was the situation? How did I respond to it? What was the outcome? And if I could go back in time, what would I do differently? Um, so Ashley and I, my like co-leader person, we scheduled meetings with a bunch of like directors of the identity centers at CSU. And particularly, we were really excited to meet with the director of the Pride Resource Center because there were a lot of queer folks within RAM recovery. And we know that within the LGBTQIA plus community, substance use is prevalent. And so we went in as like prepared as we had for other things, where it's like we just want to talk about RAM recovery and like what we do and how we want it to, again, like be more of a part of the campus in like a permanent way. And the director's response was like not particularly warm, which was like the last thing that we expected, because a lot of the other folks that we had met with were like so excited, like wanting to help, even though like we couldn't necessarily articulate what help would look like at that time. But it was like a weird moment of like, some people are not going to care or understand, which again was like not something that we had encountered yet. So we were like, oh wow. And so it was hard not to internalize that or say like, oh, I guess the director doesn't like me or I'm doing something wrong. But it really kind of got us thinking like, how do we be even more specific when we like talk to campus stakeholders, to kind of connect the dots for them about why they should care, because it might not always be sort of the narrative of, again, like there are students in recovery on campus, we need to build a community for them, because I think for some folks that might not seem as compelling as it might for like someone that works at the health center or does AOD counseling and things like that. So yeah, it was like a weird awakening. So in response, again, I tried not to like internalize that interaction as like they don't like me or I did something wrong. I was just like, okay, that wasn't the outcome that I anticipated, but like I still am invested in building a relationship with this office and with this person, because I think it could lead to something related to the success of the community. I processed that it wasn't personal and I learned something. And then in terms of what I would do differently, I just wrote, be prepared for attitudes that aren't positive, but don't necessarily let that discourage you. Does that make sense? Cool. All right. So the next example, and I'm sure this is fairly common. And so in a RAM recovery meeting, a couple folks were talking about substance use, mostly related to kind of like alternative treatments for mental health disorders, related to like ketamine treatment or psychotropic drugs, and kind of like using those either connected to a doctor or kind of like using them recreationally to address mental health concerns. And so we hadn't necessarily established like group norms around that. And so the response from myself and Ashley was very much like wanting to make sure that we address the group, to make sure that any discussion of substance use wouldn't lead to someone feeling like triggered or them wanting to potentially use again. And so checking in about that was kind of our first priority. And then the next thing we did was kind of regroup to start to talk about like what are group norms within the all recovery meetings. And that was important for us to outline, just because it's almost easier to, I guess, like problem solve around the foundation that you made versus kind of making it up as you go, which is a little bit of what we were doing. But yeah, establishing norms and needs is what we discussed after the fact. the outcome and result was more structure was created and values were more solidified. And I would ask more questions, and I would have tried to maybe have some of these conversations a little bit earlier. Um, so something else I wanted to emphasize, um, Ashley and I came from like very different recovery experiences related to her having graduated from the UConn program, which was like, I think, very heavily abstinence based. And I kind of came more from the sort of belief or desire that folks that were maybe still using or practicing harm reduction would still be able to like engage with our programs and with our people. And so that's also what a lot of this conversation was about, which is kind of like a dialogue as old as time in terms of collegiate recovery, is like, how do we negotiate the space that for some folks, it's like best if it's abstinence based, but we also, it's like, it's not worth doing if we're not also kind of trying to reach the folks that that again like need the support, need to see other students in recovery like thriving, and like bringing them into the community. Right. Yeah. So this is also one I wanted to talk about because um, these are, yeah, difficult conversations that came up as we were like Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the hill, and then the boulder like rolls back down. And so, because that's kind of what building a collegiate recovery community can feel like. Um, so the situation is that like, particularly when you have other students and other stakeholders involved, everyone sort of has different ideas of like what a successful collegiate recovery community looks like. And sometimes I think folks are wrapped up in like how many people came to meetings, how many folks have moved through your program and graduated. And it's like very sexy to have like numbers to put into like an annual report and things like that. But I think it's also just as rich to have like qualitative information in terms of like the stories of students. So it's not necessarily the number of folks that you've had in your programs, but like how they have affected even the few that have been engaged. And so that's something I really tried to emphasize. It's like, it's not about how many people came to our naloxone training. It's about how many people like saw that we had this collegiate recovery community. We're interested in talking about harm reduction and opioid use disorder. Like, it's much bigger than just quantity. So I worked really hard to make sure that if like other people were contributing to the community, that like we acknowledged like I see you helping us do this, because it was all very like grassrootsy in terms of like we built this thing ourselves. And yeah, it was important to make connections, whether that's like with other students, with like other health or mental health and substance use related organizations in the community, just trying to make your reach as far as you can. Another thing that I kind of learned to do, I like refused to get discouraged. I was like, I'm trying to remember, like if we didn't get a grant or something, or if only a few people came to an all recovery meeting, other members would be kind of frustrated, like, oh, our group isn't growing, or like, what are we doing wrong? And I would emphasize like, it's enough for us to just be here and like have the space, but also validating other folks when they're feeling frustrated and like the output isn't as rich or big as the input. Something that I think it's important to do is establish realistic expectations, and also create benchmarks. And that can be like any space of time, in terms of like a 3-year plan, or even like a quarterly sort of like meeting where you kind of process how things are going and what should change. So I think like not being afraid of reflecting and course correcting if there are things that feel like they need to be adjusted in order to include more folks. All right. So things that are just kind of overarching suggestions related to like conflict and being in community. Fostering a culture of appreciation, which I kind of just talked about. Um, Asking for feedback. So this is a big one, I think, within student affairs, and again, within what it looks like to co-create something, is like asking the people involved in the group, like, are we on the right road, path? And so, yeah, feedback is awesome. And like not being afraid of it, I think is a big thing too. And always with feedback, it's like you can take it and be like, oh my God, this was super helpful. I kind of know how we should adjust, versus being like, that's a cute thing. Maybe we'll wait about it. Or kind of like trying to get more information if it's something that feels like questionable to you. Being a part of a team. This seems very obvious, but I think it's also easy to get into the mindset of like, if I don't do it, then it won't get done right. Or I don't know, just kind of like focus more on individualism and like yourself versus always kind of considering the collective needs. Processing any defensiveness that arises. I kind of connected that to asking for feedback. But if your initial response to feedback or initial response to conflict is like all the reasons why you're not wrong, I think that's a very normal reflex. But I think it's also okay to like sit with that and think like, are the knee-jerk things that I'm defensive about, is that helping the conversation, or is that like opening the dialogue, or is that kind of shutting it down? There's always more than one right way to do something. And so I think what's also really beautiful about collegiate recovery and like doing it with students is that like the more input and ideas you have, like the more rich and beautiful this thing could be. So I think it's also important to acknowledge that, again, like your first idea could be made infinitely cooler by like the next person that you chat with. Take your time and be thoughtful. This is just kind of related to like, I think specifically for RAM recovery, it would have been easy for Ashley and I to kind of like make decisions on behalf of the group. But again, like asking for feedback and making sure that you're engaging with others versus, again, like making decisions kind of in the moment could lead to more like collective decision making. Don't avoid conflict. And I think by this, I mean like, yeah, don't be afraid of it because it usually has like really good end results. And then my favorite, discomfort equals growth, which is exactly what it sounds like. Like I think in the conversations that you feel like most icky or like kind of like vulnerable are the ones that lead to like really cool stuff. It's question time.
Yay.
Should I stop sharing my screen?
Yeah, for now.
Okay.
I am gonna, just so people know, I'm gonna put the link to the next webinar in chat. Don't leave and then go take care of that, but I'm gonna put it in now and I'll also put it in at the end, just so that you all have it, since we have 2 webinars left. But for now, Kat and Amy, have fun.
Oh my God. Thanks.
So, hi.
Hi.
Kat, the student voice liaison for everyone that doesn't know. So Amy, it was interesting to hear you talk about kind of some of the conflict that arose from multiple pathways. And I would love to hear if you could give us a few examples of in person, like what that looked like and how you resolved that conflict.
Yes, I don't know if I have like all of the answers related to the multiple pathways piece. And I think even like to this day, I struggle with like maybe how that played out, because I do think it may have ended up sort of like alienating the folks who kind of initially had the conversations in the meeting. And then again, my co-person's response was kind of like, oh my God, this isn't good. Even though I think at the time I perceived it as like, oh, these two people are kind of connecting about this method of treatment that they've both considered or done. And so that was also a moment where I had to do like the seek to understand piece. And I think that's really where I came upon this idea that I think folks sometimes feel like very tethered to their specific pathway. Like, this is how I did it. And so this is how it needs to maybe show up for other people. Or I think like folks need it to be abstinence based because they are abstinence based. And if it doesn't support their pathway, then it like they feel some type of way about that. And so I mostly think it's important to just keep talking about. And again, kind of always having the community reflect what the folks in it are needing. And at that point, I think we needed to talk about ketamine as a treatment for mental health or like PTSD, which I'm sure is like very real across our communities too, as folks that have like comorbidities related to mental health. And so I would rather have those conversations than have folks feel like they can't. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I my personal CRC is harm reduction based, alternative pathways to recovery based. When you're beginning to have those conversations with folks, for example, like the administration. So if people in the community aren't ready to like address certain issues like diversity, equity, inclusion, harm reduction, multiple pathways, what would you think are some baby steps to get that rolling?
Yeah. I think RAM Recovery got very lucky in terms of like the community that it's in terms of like CSU and also Fort Collins. And so the health district, who we worked with on a couple of things, had very recently developed a campaign for the county. I can't think of what it's called, but it was focused on how like addiction is a brain disease versus like the moral failing piece. And so it worked very nicely that like changing minds is what the campaign was called. So it worked nicely that kind of like the narrative that was trying to be sort of like deconstructed within the community is also the narrative that we wanted to tell on campus related to substance use disorder being a brain disease. And additionally, like having folks in recovery on campus is an asset versus a deficit. And so I think it's very hard to like maybe talk to someone who doesn't understand harm reduction about like how harm reduction is not enabling, but it's like providing bodily autonomy and maybe like steps to being connected to like medical help. And so it's hard to explain those things to folks who don't understand it. But I think, again, sort of talking about recovery as a disease instead of a moral failing, and then also talking about how, like, again, folks in recovery are like the dopest. And so having them on your campus and supporting them is like an investment in the community versus something that we should be like fearful of. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. We definitely can like enrich the community.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question in the chat. So how do you navigate the us versus them? So the idea of team, specifically regarding, HR and abstinence. Yeah.
Ooh, I also don't have a super good answer to this. I want to try to understand like where folks come from if they are like ride or die abstinence-based recovery. And because like it's not going to be the same. And I think like that's the only main point I can articulate is like it doesn't like lessen someone in abstinence-based recovery if someone else is like abstinent from one substance, but maybe like still uses a different one that wasn't their substance of challenge. Like that doesn't, and I think maybe that's part of what they're wrapped up in is like, my recovery is the best. And if you're not doing mine, then like I have a problem with that. So it's also kind of related to like equity and identity and things like that. Like you can't necessarily change someone's mind who is very, who like can only understand their own experience. And so it takes a lot of energy to try to like humanize and defend yourself constantly. So I think sometimes it's like reflecting, like, I'm not doing anything wrong, and like what I think isn't wrong, and like what the other person thinks isn't wrong either, but like there's some barrier there that's not allowing them to like see me and my recovery as legitimate. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I think on like definitely on both sides, like there can be a view of like your recovery is wrong. You know,
Hmm.
you could be like me and use maybe a drink every once in a while, or
Hmm.
no, this is wrong. You can't have just one drink. That's your whole sobriety. I think it can be like really black and white
Hmm.
when we're having these conversations. And so one of the things is like I think you can use a lot of, you know, we're talking about open communication. I think we can
Hmm.
use a lot of like emotional pleas
Yes.
during this. So I'd ask you like how can we prevent shame and guilt from entering conversations with others?
Hmm. Yeah. Um, I feel like I'm talking about conflict and like talking about these things like I have it all figured out and it's very easy. But I do think um kind of like the clarity and confidence and understanding of myself has kind of like helped with having some of those conversations. Um, and so like I don't have shame or guilt around my recovery. And I think again, I feel like the thesis of some of the questions is like that person's an asshole and like don't let them phase you. But that's kind of part of it too, is like I know that my recovery is like rock solid, and so if anybody tried to fight with me about it or kind of like tried to tell me that it was wrong, I'd be like, I don't think so. And again, I would kind of try to have the conversation of like, what's going on with you that you feel like some type of way about what I'm doing. um but yeah, shame and guilt again are, and I feel like we talk about this a lot in like the mental health intensive outpatient that I was like co-facilitating at my last job. But like shame and guilt don't get us anywhere. Like those feelings are kind of like a hamster wheel of um I don't know, of like not being able to kind of have the breakthroughs of finding the confidence and um uh yeah, like those aren't productive feelings. And so in addition to having conversations with other people, I would also kind of want to help them move through some of those things. Like I feel I've resolved that, but if again, if somebody else was kind of like not sure how they felt about their recovery or moving from abstinence based to maybe something else, I'd be like I would love to process this with you, to move past the shame and guilt and into like you are in charge of your own gig, and so like how can we help you do this safely?
Yeah, I think that's great. I think it's so important to help people like become the best of themselves, right? Because
Mhm.
like when you're in a good space with yourself, then you're actually able to have good conversation with other
Yes.
people. So this really leads me into asking you now, if you're just sitting here and you're watching two members of your CRC, or I don't know, say like a member of administration and the person
Mhm.
helping you run your CRC, just people around you, right? If you're watching people around you enter into these conflicts because they aren't necessarily doing the things we're doing, how can you help two people outside of yourself? What's the
Mhm.
point of meddling and what's the point of trying to help
Mhm.
them bridge the gap?
Sure, sure. um I love meddling, which is not a good thing. But I also like before entering that dialogue or saying like, hey, how can I mediate this conversation? I would be like, is this something you want to try to discuss in a way that's like that might lead to an outcome, or at least kind of start detangling what sort of like tension exists? Um, and so I think I would still focus on the like seeking to understand thing, because I think again like defensiveness is usually our first instinct. And so I think a lot of the initial tangled shit is the defensiveness. And then kind of trying to like again validate both people related to how they're feeling, and then kind of I guess kind of use counseling skills of like reflecting back to them what they're saying. um and yeah, like make meaning for both people related to how they might have like we might find commonness in whatever the conflict is. And something I learned as an RA when we talked about conflict is that like there doesn't necessarily need to be like an end, or like it doesn't necessarily need to be solved, but like finding a space where both folks feel, I guess, like humanized and heard, um, and safe. I think is kind of like where the goal should be, or where the end might look like for me untangling a situation with two people.
I love that. I have 2 follow-up questions immediately.
Yeah.
I'll feed them to you one by one.
Sure.
So when we're in that area, what are some like seeking to understand questions to help people bridge that gap?
Yeah. Mm, um, I think like open-ended is a good place to start, just because like that then kind of invites like a narrative or like a story. And honestly, like the most recent conversation I had where I had to do the seeking to understand piece was talking to my dad about like race and Blackness. And so it was a lot of questions of like how did you come to believe this, or like what did you learn or not learn that like made you develop like this particular value. And so I don't know if there's like specific types of questions that are seeking to understand, other than kind of like effectively communicating related to like eye contact and body language, and not kind of like stiffening or closing yourself off, but being like, I'm inviting this to be like a back and forth because I want to understand where you come from, versus like, you're wrong, I don't want to talk about it anymore. Like, don't. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I really like what you're having to say. It's like definitely like I think a lot of people's first instinct when we're having these conversations is to say like, let me convince you.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I think like actually stepping back and just going into, maybe the therapist role, or maybe,
Mm-hmm.
the more psychological role of just like trying to really first understand their perspective. Because I think in conversations that are difficult like this, we can so easily just choose sides.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's super important. Now, when we're having these conversations that could be highly charged, like about race and all these things, when is it okay to disagree? And like, how would you say it's good to healthily communicate that?
Mm-hmm. I think my like consistent threshold is if someone is like not able to empathize or kind of like process what marginalization is, or like the experience of other people. I think that's where I would encourage folks to like save their emotional energy. And so I'm trying to think of like an example of that. So this isn't my lived experience, but if like a trans or non-binary person was like talking to their parent, and the parent was kind of like not asking questions to understand, or just being like just kind of saying things that like didn't lead to a conversation of like, I want to understand you, but instead kind of like I don't get it, kind of like stopping the conversation by saying stuff like that. It's like, okay, that's not taking us anywhere. So I think hopefully folks can sense like if things are going in circles, or you feel like the other person is like deeply delegitimizing like who you are, I think that's like a very important point to step away. And the other thing that comes to mind, and like I think about this a lot related to coworkers, is like sometimes there's an expectation that like everybody gets along, they hang out outside of work, like everybody is friends. And like I've never operated that way. I don't think that's a realistic expectation. And so it's also kind of understanding like you're not going to get along with everyone and see everything the same way, and that is totally okay. And it's also okay if somebody has decided that they don't like you for some reason. Usually, again, like that's not always a reflection of you. It might be something going on with them. And that also comes with kind of the confidence of being like this whole thing is fine. Yeah.
Definitely. Now,
Mhm.
I think you touched on like a great point, is that we're going to have people on like all ends of the spectrum. We're going to have people, like where you're at, where they're really able to healthily communicate these things. We're going to have people like the parents we were talking about on the other end, where they can't even have a conversation about it without shutting it down. We're going to have people somewhere in the middle that are, gaining the ability to talk about these things and have healthy disagreements and communication. Now, when we're all trying to build a community together, how can we create communities with people when they might not have the skills that we've been talking about today?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And again, like I guess I have 2 points, but like CSU was special in terms of we had like a conflict resolution center that specifically did kind of like opt-in classes or classes that were like sanctions for conduct violations. But there was a lot of tools and resources available on our campus to help students negotiate conflict if they were like really stuck. Additionally, RAs and like student staff members are usually like coached or trained on how to handle like roommate disagreements and things like that. And it's also, again, kind of that like willingness to engage in discomfort. And I think particularly, I can't like cite a source related to science and brain development, but I think the threshold between like high school and undergrad, I feel like what we find a lot is that folks are conflict avoidant. And like some of the first things we ask students if they have a conflict is like, have you talked to the other person? And the answer is usually no. And so kind of like giving them the tools in the most basic way to like start a conversation, I think is like somewhere on that spectrum of like being able to engage with it. And the other piece is the roller derby league that I'm on has like a conflict resolution team sort of. And so kind of having a process for like, maybe there's someone within the student organization or someone within the collegiate recovery community that can be a mediator, but also kind of handle any like reporting type stuff. So with FOCO, how it works is like there's a form online that kind of says like, who is your conflict with? What would be your ideal outcome? And then we kind of like give them a few different options of like, we can do a mediation, you can agree to talk to the other person and like see what the outcome is. And so in addition to providing like tips of like, might be like a good way to approach the situation. Additionally, having resources within the collegiate recovery community to say like, Amy's the person to go to if so-and-so is like messing with you and y'all need to talk about it or move through it.
This is a great lead-in for this next question, which is, what are some ways we can practice cooperating and inspiring others without sacrificing our boundaries and values when confronting a difficult situation? I think a mediator might be helpful in that situation. What else do you think would be helpful with keeping our boundaries?
Yeah. I think I mentioned this earlier, but like, it's okay to walk away. And I think folks are also like really uncomfortable with that idea of like, it's also the, like, if couples go to bed angry, like that's something that's like, oh no, like, I don't know, you must not have a healthy relationship if you go to bed mad. But that might not be a realistic expectation for like people's communication style. I know I'm like not a particularly fast processor. So ideally, if I were in a conflict, I would be like, let's do part 1 and then maybe part 2. So it's okay to find like a logical end to the initial conversation and then agree to kind of like pick it up later. So it doesn't feel good to not, again, have things like wrapped up in a tiny package with a bow. But it can also give you, again, like more time to process like what has been said before, again, you're like reacting. And yeah, I think that's an important kind of emotional boundary too, of like if you're mentally exhausted, it's like you don't want to say something that could, again, like be potentially harmful that you might not say if you were not mentally exhausted and like pissed. So that's something that came to mind initially.
Yeah, definitely. I think there should be a moment when you walk away when it's giving too much of yourself to somebody. And on the note of like giving yourself too much to somebody, we've been talking a lot about like conflict, but also, you know, in recovery, we see a lot of codependency. We see a lot of those kinds of things. So when you're building a tight-knit community where everyone's really depending on each other, how can you create the boundary of codependency, especially for those that are newer in recovery?
That's a really good question, and something that I don't know if there's necessarily like a right or wrong way to do that. Um, and I'm specifically thinking about like when new folks would come into the community, like we would give them all our phone number. We would be like, if you're not okay, like please call us. Like we want to hang out, we want to be social. And so we didn't necessarily do a good job talking about boundaries in those initial conversations. And usually, if students ever gave me their number, I would be very explicit about like, I'm a residence director on campus, I'm not a student, just in case like there were some reporting issues going on, or if they disclosed something that I would need to report as like a responsible employee. I made sure that my role in the community and on campus was made explicit. And I would also ask like, do you want me to reach out to you, or do you want to like wait for other people to reach out to you? So I think people probably really appreciate having the conversation versus maybe like passing a boundary later and then having to like reel it back. And so like, I don't know if we have specific experiences with codependency, but I think the piece about being a community is about like having those boundaries related to like when to contact folks. And the other thing I can think of is we were kind of like tangentially connected to like student health services, and none of us like serving in the collegiate recovery community, I guess out of Ashley and I, are like, neither of us are mental health professionals. And so a few instances came up where it's like, this individual might be suicidal. And so I kind of did like the brief intervention type thing of like, do you have a plan? Kind of all those, again, like brief questions, and then making sure that they had resources to other folks on campus that could better address what was going on versus like just doing kind of like peer-to-peer triage of something like that. So it's kind of adjacent to codependency, but the thought is like, it's okay to know when you're out of your expertise area and say like, hey, there's resources on campus that could better serve what's going on with you.
Yeah, I've definitely had the same thing come up in my community. Like we had to be very careful not to create too much of a therapeutic space or offer too much like therapy. We were thinking about like starting a hotline. That was like a no-go. Because there's definitely that boundary, and I definitely agree. It's so much easier to set them in the beginning than it is to reel them back, you know? Because like once it's established, it's like what we say about first impressions, right? Like the first impression, you'd have to make like 10 other impressions to change that.
Right.
So how do you balance the accountability with care during like this cancel culture? How do we find the middle ground between loving community and protecting the community?
Yeah. Yeah. I have initial thoughts. So I guess this is completely off the cuff. So everything I'm saying is an initial thought. And so something that was in the Mia Birdsong book, How We Show Up, talked about how like you can't make someone be accountable. Like you can walk with them on their journey of accountability, but you can't make someone like reflect on their harm and then like try to do better. And so I think I would struggle with the idea of like, in my head, I'm like, what if there was a strike system? Like if someone did like 3 units of harm in a community, it's like you're out. But that's like not necessarily measurable, right? And so I also think about kind of like the hierarchy within the community, or like, is this a democratic sort of setup? Do people vote if there is someone doing harm and they like shouldn't be engaged anymore? But like none of those things feel good. And so I'm kind of trying to untangle like how would I handle that, and also how would I handle that in a way that feels like it's serving the community best. Um, and so I like the idea of like walking with someone through accountability and like how they can start to repair. But I think it would also be important to me to like process with other members of the group, like what is at stake for other people if this person stays, if that makes sense. Like, is it the safety of the group that could be in jeopardy? Is it like the recovery and well-being of other people? And so those are like not cute conversations to have. But I think related to accountability and membership and being in community, like that's the sticky shit that you have to be able to talk about.
Yeah, I think you bring up a key thing also is that each collegiate recovery community is going to be so different, in the
Yeah.
structure and the way it's run, are there advisors? Are these the people that
Mhm.
deciding who's coming? There's such a discrepancy. I think you're right. It's really important to maybe think about these things proactively as you're building your collegiate community, to think like, what would we do if something like this
Mhm.
were to happen? Now, what we're talking about is kind of like an interesting line. And so I'd ask you, so how do you navigate the tension that comes up when you're fighting between protecting people and
Mhm.
empowering people?
Mhm.
Because you need to protect people but empower them at the same time. And how do you navigate that?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. I think I never perceived my role as an advisor to be protecting anyone. So that word is like I'm kind of hung up on that. Um, but like empowering is like absolutely what we're going for. And so yeah, protect is like whoa. And so something we talked a lot about, and something that again like myself and my co-person kind of like didn't have the same understanding of is the concept of safety. And so I think um, Ashley's understanding of safety, I'm going to just share this story, but I'm not trying to drag her whatsoever. She's a beautiful person. We had this conversation and it was like helpful again for us to process like how we had different understandings of this. But Ashley's understanding of safety was literally anything that could jeopardize someone's recovery. And my understanding of safety is like if there were two people in RAM recovery and one was like the perpetrator of violence against the other person, like that feels very apparent to me, and definitely a conversation where I would advocate for the perpetrator to like not be sharing the space with the impacted person. Um, and so I think what's kind of helpful in the college setting is that there's kind of like already standards of conduct where you can draw lines very specifically. And so I guess an example of this, there was a member of RAM Recovery who was like a non-traditional student, and he would have like really long periods of sobriety, and then have a reoccurrence of use. And then it usually ended in him being like suspended or having some sort of conduct issue. None of the conduct issues were ever related to like hurting anyone else. And so even though he was facing sort of like punitive pieces from the institution, I did not perceive that he would be like a threat to other people. So I don't know if that's like a helpful bar to start with. But yeah, protection and safety, that's wild. I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm so like mind blown by that concept. But yes, I think at the end of the day, empowering is huge. And part of empowering someone is like knowing kind of what to ask so that they feel like they're in control of the situation. And that's kind of how you respond to, like I was a victim advocate for a while. And like, that is how you approach someone who is a survivor, is like, how can we make you feel as in control of your being and what's going on as possible. So I think like that's would always be my focus versus like protection in terms of like I know what's best for someone, which is like not the case.
Now, we kind of touched on it. So we're talking about a time when your community was tested. I would like love to hear more specifically about how you bridge that gap.
Which gap are you talking about?
The gap between the form of thought of like either people are like really, like literally harming one another, or, anything that jeopardizes sobriety. Like, how did you bridge that?
Yeah, I think it kind of showed up at the expense that people who had been having the conversation about using substances felt like they couldn't come back, or felt like kind of ostracized. And so and I think the conversation between Ashley and I is like, that is not the goal. It's not the goal to kind of like try to necessarily control what people say in order to decide to exclude them or decide that they don't belong in the group. And so I don't know if there was necessarily a resolution so much as like we saw what the consequences were of the reaction that happened in the moment. The reaction being like, you can't talk about ketamine and mushrooms in the meeting, even though they were talking about it in the context again of like alternative treatment to mental health stuff. So yeah, it was more of like a consequence type of lesson, more so than like a conflict conversation that led to a resolution.
Okay. Waiting for any final questions from the audience. No, I don't think so. So just to like wrap up, I would ask you, what's your best advice to our attendees today for how they can improve their communication with others? What is something that they can do in their next conflict to get their point across and be heard?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think this is something that also came up in the Mia Birdsong book, but like vulnerability is also something that feels gross when you're doing it, of like, my guts are coming out of my body in the form of words that are my feelings. And so I think one of the most important things is like not being afraid to like communicate what's going on in your head and heart, even if it feels like misplaced based on like you feel like you're having a logistic conversation about your community, and then something comes into your head of like I don't know, something comes up where you're like, this is a feeling, but it's an important thing to express in the context of whatever the conversation is. So I think vulnerability is a big one. And also, I think, and I absolutely would describe myself as defensive, like in my undergrad career and in grad school. I was like, don't fuck with me. like I will, I don't know. I was just like, I'm right, you're wrong. Like it needs to happen the way I need it to happen. Which is kind of also a manifestation of learning in recovery. Like you can't control very many things. But kind of processing, like, again, defensiveness doesn't usually lead to like the growth piece. It really just kind of, again, puts you into a cycle of trying to understand the other person and trying to be understood, but like never breaching that sort of barrier. So being vulnerable, which is disgusting, and trying not to be defensive.
Thank you. That's really great. That's what I always say. So I'm happy to hear you say it too.
Yes.
Yeah, this was phenomenal. Thank you both. I'm just like, I'm sitting here thinking about like the fear question, because I think that comes like, I remember Amy and I, when we were working together with like brain recovery stuff, our job basically was like to always see everything as like empowering.
Mm-hmm.
And then what we do, I made a comment in the chat of like, but I have still seen around the country when we work with schools, a lot of the concern becomes, but I need to protect these students. And but if you're a staff person, that is kind of part of your job. But I've gotten in the habit of asking people like, what are you afraid of? Like, what is a fear for you right now? If you're like so concerned, not to like be facetious, but to honestly ask the question can be pretty helpful sometimes, because usually when we have conflicts in collegiate recovery that we're not actually talking about, it's some deep-seated stuff that we need to get into, hopefully in a vulnerable way, in a healthy way, but fingers crossed.
Thank you for adding that part too, of like, just ask like, what are you afraid of? Because I think sometimes student affairs professionals are in the protection business because they also perceive students still as like adolescents, or like they call them kids when they're not kids. And something we talk a lot about in like substance use disorder, like treatment and recovery, is experiencing natural consequences. And I think sometimes that's also what professionals perceive is like, and it's almost parental of like, you don't want anything bad to happen to them. So like, but if shit happens, like then you process with them like what the outcome is and where to go next. You can't control what natural consequences. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, thank you, Amy. Thank you, Kat. You both did a
Thank you.
phenomenal job. We'll be around still for a few more minutes if folks in chat want to stay around and ask any more questions. We can take you off mute and we can have a quick conversation. But I'm gonna, if I have it still, I'm gonna put the link to the next webinar in the chat. Many of you in the audience have to sign up for that or in order to finish your Leadership Academy stuff. It's Daryl. You all heard Daryl during the Leadership Summit. Daryl's a powerhouse. So hopefully I'll see you then. And then again, everyone have a good night.
Sweet.